Tem um momento na carreira que precisamos dar um passo além. É hora de fazer uma pós-graduação. Só que muitas vezes o custo pesa no bolso, inviabilizando tudo. Com a pós-graduação do Senac, você não tem esse problema. Cursos com até 50% de desconto e muito mais tempo para pagar. TCC opcional, modelo flexível com aulas presenciais e online e alguns cursos com apenas 12 meses de duração. Não tem mais desculpa, hein? Saiba mais em sp.senac.br/pós-graduação.
Hello, mega orderers. Today is November 5th, 2024. A day which may go down in infamy, or a day which may go down in history as saving us from disorder and promoting order. As we're recording, we don't know. I have that pit in the bottom of my stomach that I have every time we have one of these major elections, because I understand how events in America ripple outward and affect Europe, China, every issue area that we talk about on this podcast, from climate change to the regulation of AI to wealth inequality, essentially everything. Our futures all ripple out from this moment in time. So, given that there are so many potential futures potentially emerging from this moment, we thought we would have an episode on futures. How do people plan for different futures? How do they speculate for different futures? And what can we learn from people who do plan for those futures? So, we hope that you find this episode about futures with Jane Kinninmont and Cat Tully relevant and easing as you're contemplating the different futures that may emerge. Without further ado, I'll kick it over to Jane.
I'm delighted to be joined today by my friend Cat Tully, who is a person who professionally examines the future. She would like to be described as futures adjacent. She runs something called the School of International Futures, which applies futures and foresight methodologies in different settings. She previously worked in government in the UK, working on delivery for the Prime Minister and policy planning and so on. But she now works with governments around the world, with the UN, with NATO, with civil society, anyone who's got an interest in the future, really, which I suppose is all of us. So, Cat, welcome to the Disorder Show.
Oh, Jane, it's so lovely to be here.
Tell us a bit about your professional background. What was it that led you to focus in this way on looking forward as the focus of your work?
Well, apart from people who look at entrails and crystal balls, it's not really a job description you get given when you're looking at GCSEs and A-levels. It's like, do you want to work in futures? But what I think I've always been interested in is how the intersection between the public and the private and the civil society sector can come together to think about the future and create a better world, really. So I was interested in governance, I was interested in issues of international development, and through that I kind of fell into this area, and it's been quite an amazing journey, and one I think that kind of mimics a lot of other people's interest in how you systematically explore the futures. And actually one of the things that we use in our profession is the term futures, always in the plural, and think about how it's a space for exploration and collaboration and innovative solutions. So that's a little bit been the journey that I followed, and it's been really fun.
But it's interesting because it seems like right now a lot of people are looking at the future and they're seeing something that is very, very bleak. We've just had this big UN summit for the future, but for most people, that's probably overshadowed by the sight of lots of people meeting at the UN while wars continue to rage on. So how do you begin to bridge that gap and get people to see looking forward collectively as something that is going to be helpful?
So I always think of the work that we do, which is strategic foresight, which is a structured way of thinking about the futures in a way that helps you unlock from the paradigm and the thinking of the present and helps you realize that actually change happens. in particular, in these times of the old structures, especially the old political and governance structures that have lasted and upheld us for the last 70 years, are really crumbling in the face of the kind of social, economic, and technological changes that have happened, and we need to reimagine new ones, it can really feel like a time of despair because the old systems fail to do what they used to, and yet we haven't got the space and the resourcing to really imagine what the new structures might look like. So whether you're talking about economic structures, whether you're talking about how to govern and take advantage of new emerging technologies, whether you're talking about the old structures around containing nuclear counterproliferation, the practice of thinking about the future systematically, especially with different types of voices in the room, is a practice that can really help regain hope in a moment of where leaders feel despair and focus on narratives of polycrisis and insufficiency. So this Summit of the Future that just took place in New York 2 weeks ago is at a time of real international conflict and where multilateral systems and governance mechanisms are really struggling to contain the kind of challenges, whether demographic, emerging technology, geopolitical challenges that we face, and attitudinal ones. But at the same time, there were signals of hope. And the Declaration on Future Generations was signed by 193 countries at that summit. And there we established a new global norm that means that all countries have decided that when they're making decisions, that they should take the well-being of future generations into account as well as current ones. And I think that is a very powerful norm that holds insights and the potential for connecting all the great thinkers and doers to put the kind of work that they're doing back at the centre and reimagining better and more hopeful futures.
Wow, that's so fascinating, and there's lots that we'll be getting into there. I mean, maybe since we got started talking about the Summit for the Future, we can delve a bit further into that. It sounds very positive, future generations. How can people actually try to make that meaningful? I mean, I'm kind of imagining there's a lot of people, a lot of diplomats doing the rounds in New York that are just signing up to things that sound nice and fluffy and warm and something positive. How do you actually then use that as a basis to make something happen?
Well, interestingly enough, to your point about diplomats in New York, the rest of the summit that talked about conflict prevention, talked about nuclear, talked about climate change, sustainable development, financing for development, management of space, Security Council reform. These were all conversations that are well known by diplomats. And in fact, there was incremental and relatively positive movement, definitely a few steps back as well as some steps forward. But on future generations, in fact, it's quite the opposite. Where the innovative practice is happening is at the community and the national level. So you have a caucus of the future in Kenya that has just been started. It's a bipartisan group of senators from 5 different parties going, we need to actually make decisions in Kenya in the interests of future as well as current generations, because the way that AI is being rolled out in farms is compromising the sustainable livelihoods for women and youth, because the way that the Kenyan government is currently addressing the debt crisis because of investments that it took out earlier is to cut education in primary schools, which basically then means that younger people in the future are going to be compromised. So it's when you start seeing innovative action like the well-being budgeting that's happening in New Zealand, the long-term insights briefing that's being developed in Australia, the future generations legislation that is being brought by Mark O'Casey in Ireland. It's all these really interesting examples of political officials who are innovating, going, we need to make better decisions today because of the challenges that we face, and we're going to do something about it. There's all this really interesting developments that are happening that give us the space to make different decisions in the interests of the long term, to embrace and understand the implications of emerging technology, to understand the implications of alternative scenarios, and basically, I never use the word future-proof, but at least be future aware of what might be coming down the pipeline towards us, so we are relatively more prepared for the future.
I'm also remembering someone brilliant I spoke to last week who was talking about the civil society feminist movements around the world that pushed for the UN to pass the Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. And she said that she met a much older woman politician who said to her, well done. And she said, yes, we've achieved it. We've done it. And the woman politician said, oh no, this is not the end. This is the beginning.
This is where the hard work starts. Oh, yes, absolutely. This is where we need to start rolling our sleeves up.
Where does that take place? Because it does sound like linking down into communities and local governments and mayors and all of these things. Like, is that something that can happen through the UN? Is the UN too high level and maybe clunky to do it? And what are the kind of networks that come into play to grapple with the complex set of actors that are involved?
At the multilateral level, I think the UN is particularly great at driving and building norms. Its agencies from UNDP and WHO are also excellent at, potentially driving expertise in governance and health, and future generations absolutely has a role to play in that. But from a multilateral perspective, I think that this agenda is really going to make a difference when it's incorporated and taken on by the G20, by different multilateral organizations like the OECD. And in fact, there's very good examples of that already happening, with the principles for responsible foresight being developed by OPSI in the OECD. The real story that people were looking at the Summit of the Future is one very close to home, which is the success of Wales, that almost 10 years ago passed legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And that is a complex, systemic approach to build the institutional capability, the technical capability in government, but then the scrutiny, accountability mechanisms with citizens to kind of go, what is the Wales that we want to live in? And how do we make it happen? And they institutionalize that. They put that in legislation, and they put a whole series of activities that means that that does embed into local communities. It does connect to civil society groups, that parts of Cardiff have conversations about the future that they want. And it's that thickening of conversations about where we want to, and be aware of the kind of risks and opportunities ahead, that's really important. It's a kind of capability that's necessary at the individual, the community, and the government level. So that's a little bit of, this is hyper-local, right? But then this is back to the disorder, but it's like, disorder is also another word for turbulence and change, right?
Yeah.
And so it's whose disorder and whose order. And I think strategic foresight can start helping you ask those questions in a structured way, to see disorder and change as part of a change of an old paradigm to a new governance, and to help you regain agency, not to kind of deny uncertainty, but more to perhaps embrace and acknowledge it, and to kind of go, despite this turbulence and disorder around us, how can we still together navigate forward? And I think that is the most powerful contribution that I think my field can provide at this moment. And it's one that's incredibly important, especially for young people who can sometimes be overwhelmed by the messages of negativity that our political leaders, in a well-meaning, but I think fundamentally very unhelpful way, are leaving them.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting, because there must be opportunities somewhere in the disorder that we see. And I guess some of the concerns that recur on our podcast are about people looking for solutions that are false solutions. So we can feel that there are many people around the world that feel that big global organizations, globalization, international financial institutions, the UN, the EU, in the case of many people in the UK, aren't delivering for them. And we get worried when they then get maybe taken in by people promising change that don't have the answers either. But there must be something in there about the need to revitalize the local and have solutions that are more responsive for people, that can help people feel more empowered and build something different. But it is a huge and complex challenge. I mean, as someone that's constantly talking to people around the world about what the future looks like, I'd love to know what you think about the future of the international order. Like, are we going to be in a world that fragments and becomes deglobalized? How different is it going to look from the future that we've grown up with?
So you're now asking me to get my crystal ball out, and I'm
Yes,
going
please.
to do the very typical futures response, which is we do not do forecasts and predictions, but we do alternatives. I always say that the benefits of strategic foresight are threefold. It's like you are both building your understanding of the environment around you by kind of, looking at the drivers of change, how they intersect, understanding the assumptions behind your systems thinking, and then using that to kind of lay out the possibility space in 3 or 4 or whatever number of scenarios that you may think of. And so it helps you explore and understand and manage and get engaged looking forward and basically managing risk in some way. But what it also does is that exercise of bringing people together also helps you then define where you want to go and what you might be prepared to do together in order to achieve your desired vision. So it's also an act of imagining and empowerment, especially if in that exercise, and this is very important, certain voices are dialed down and other voices are dialed up. And I think that is part of the psychological safety and the invisible work that a futurist does, is to power broker, essentially. But finally, you never get the future you fear or the ones that you want. But what you do have is the third benefit is by thinking about these alternative futures and looking out and forward collectively, what you're building is the capability of having surfaced your assumptions and be able to kind of react to early warning indicators and have got contingency plans. And so you've built that kind of capability. So if that's what your suite of thinking about the future is about, then I can put you to, for example, the MOD, formerly known as DCDC. Now I think the Futures team have just issued their 7th edition that they do every 4 years. So this has got a long pedigree of Global Strategic Trends work number 7. And they have put out 5 scenarios for how the world might look like out to 2050. Similarly, the UN Secretary General has got a very clear set of 2 scenarios. Either we address issues around planetary boundaries and we manage to kind of transition to a post-carbon economy, or we don't. So these are the kind of alternatives that we look at ahead. But certainly trends that I've seen coming forward is like we need to think more beyond emerging technology as AI, where there's still questions around how deeply transformative it's really going to be, versus something like synthetic biology. The other thing to look at, for example, is issues around demography, which for the past 20 or 30 years was almost not seen as being important at all. And then suddenly we've just realized, what happens to trends is not like how long they work, but it's the trajectory and it's the intersection. So suddenly issues around aging economies, youthful economies, reproductive rights are hugely driving cultural and social conversations around women's reproductive rights, patriarchy, LGBTQ, issues around immigration. So suddenly demography has been a massive issue. Another really interesting question that we are fundamentally not gripping, I think, is even if we have an effective transition to a post-carbon economy, that has a huge implication on primary commodities, rare earths and mining, which has got huge geopolitical implications, including across Africa and Latin America, and not just in traditional member states, but also in terms of indigenous communities who very often their kind of footprint of their traditional lands and their sacred lands are going to be affected in really important areas. So all of these issues bring a series of challenges, but also opportunities that if we kind of think through them, we never know the answers. We don't know whether in, for example, Angola, whether climate change is going to start making sustainable livelihoods problematic. So you have more young men going from the rural areas into the urban areas, whether that happens first, or whether the carbon transition happens first. So you have positive movements towards good governance, which means that when those climate change impacts do happen, that you've actually got a stronger governance mechanism to deal with them. So whichever comes first really has a massive implication for stability or conflict in a country, right? And you don't know, but what you can do is have two different alternative scenarios, know that those are two drivers that are really important, and also prepare your policies for each of them, and also have early warning indicators so you can kind of look out for them.
Amazing. I want to pick up on one of those issues, and then I'm going to get a bit more into like working with governments. But I really wanted to pick up on the point about demography, because it just strikes me as one of the areas where everyone seems to have got the future wrong. That for centuries, maybe, definitely for many years, people have been worried about overpopulation. And we saw, China take on the big one-child policy to try to deal with that. And now it looks like that's not the risk. And that we're in a world where birth rates are falling all over the place, and it is connected to individual choice, and many people making the individual choice that they don't think having the future generations themselves, as it were, is worthwhile. So, why did we get that so wrong? But also, how can futures people work to really think in an open-minded way and think maybe the big risks we're worrying about are not the right risks, or maybe something could end up to be totally the opposite of what we expected? How do you train yourself to think big like that?
The weak signals are always there, right? So I remember being in Russia in 2014. I was teaching Futures and Foresight in a master's program in Raniepa, which was just an amazing privilege because Russia itself has got an amazing Futures and Foresight tradition, a bit like Iran and many other interesting countries that we don't get to connect to, very sadly. And the Duma, which has no legislative power, but it is an interesting bellwether, had basically passed a law that said that women were not allowed to go to university until they'd had children. So you've got the weak signals of the weaponization of female reproduction as a social issue and a policy issue rather than a private family issue already there, and ditto. So, Jane, you've worked on the Middle East for a few years. I'm going to keep it at that.
We won't count the years anymore, but yes, quite.
But you've seen the Arab Human Development Report from 2004 or 5, and then people are like, the Arab Spring came from nowhere. And it's like, no, it's not. You always have the weak signals. The question is more, why is it that the system and the decision-making process chooses to ignore them and not act on them? I think at the personal level, when you are a leader, these changes, it's not about an analytical process of persuasion. It's about, this is fear and loss that you're facing in the changing world around you. And so people reject this, right? There is a saying, Jim Data's second law of the future is that every useful idea about the future must at first sight appear ridiculous. And he uses that term deliberately, right? Yeah. But you get it, right? So this is why teaching and training foresight is really powerful. I don't need to explain really to most people that that's because people have got perceived wisdom, and the way of protecting yourself against valid criticism and challenge to that perceived wisdom is to ridicule and laugh at it rather than to engage with it. At the same time, we can also, for example, teach you, if I take you into a scenario in 2050 that you think is ridiculous now, and we spend 5 minutes exploring it, and then I ask you, how did we get here? And I get you to come up with a pathway, a glide path from today to a future that you thought was absolutely impossible. I guarantee you, your probability assessment of that future will totally change as a result of our 15-minute exchange. So these things are kind of the reframing that happens is really powerful and important. And Three Horizons, for example, which is a way of saying, you have people in the here and the now, for example, our current carbon-based economy, who are Horizon 1 actors. And then let's say there's Horizon 3 actors, which are the people that can kind of understand and will be in our post-carbon economy. And then you have Horizon 2 actors, who are the people who help that transition, like people who, for example, in insurance companies develop new insurance for cars who are self-driving, or who are developing batteries that can go in those cars. And so if you start saying that actually, if the job of a policymaker is to hold the space to bring these people from different horizons together, then what you start doing is thinking about these three horizons and help people understand where they are and where other people are. Help people understand in the Horizon 1, you're an expert in housing or infrastructure in the here and now, but you actually need to get a young person to understand how they might have a family in a world that's enabled by AI, that is a post-carbon economy city. You really do get meaningful youth engagement rather than tokenistic stuff, because you're actually validating the evidence and the insights that people have. On the systems level, you then need the institutional mechanisms to incentivize that. And that includes how are you spending your budget? Are you assessing your current decisions for intergenerational fairness, et cetera, et cetera?
What do you do? You mentioned how some futures make people afraid or think about loss. And, what do you do when you're working with a government and they don't want to hear something? Or you're producing a future that they just don't want to think about or act on?
I mean, this is where having alternative scenarios is very helpful. For example, we did some work with a Middle East country, looking at the future of the country in a participatory way, bringing young women, kids into the conversation. And we've also done the work on, for example, the future of terrorism with the Five Eyes, where we're coming together to kind of think about what might terrorism look like in the future? What are the capabilities that you need? And in all these cases, if you're doing it well, some people will go, that is absolutely not going to happen, and I'm not prepared to talk about it. Right-wing terrorism is definitely not going to happen. It's, outside of our scope. And so that's why stretching the time horizon into the future far enough will often open things up for you, really. And so if you're getting that kind of pushback, I often just extend further out and see where you can get to. Another option, because sometimes it's not okay at all and it's just like limited, is just to accept that it's on a journey, right? So you kind of have a shorter iteration, you do a small amount of work, you develop alternative scenarios, and then you will find someone in the process that goes, but what about, let's challenge that assumption. But what you're doing is you're making it clear that the person who has said you must not look at that is making an assumption, and then you let people in that space and in that community decide whether you want to challenge that assumption or not. And so all you're there to hold the space and to make explicit, to help people to unlock from the views of the present that they have and play with time.
After the break, we'll order the disorder. So now we're talking about ordering the disorder, and I think you've given us something really useful to think about in the idea that disorder is inevitable, and it's really about how we do this ordering as a global society, maybe, that will determine what the future is going to be like. But maybe you can tell our listeners a bit about why futures or futures adjacent work is helpful to bring about a better and more orderly world. Why should we be trying to think in this expansive and long-term way?
Futures itself has a way of thinking about how time happens and how change happens. That whole saying of there are decades where nothing happens and then days in which decades happen. Or it has a way of helping you think about how second and third and fourth order implications of technology, how it kind of feeds through to economy, social and political change, how, for example, the Gutenberg press ended up 100 years later in the Reformation. And it has a really nice way of helping you understand how governance and political superstructures can be really sticky. And so every 70 and 80 years that there are these kind of moments of readdressing, if you like, recorrection, where the political and legal and governance infrastructures can then fit the changes that have happened during those past decades around economic and social and technological realities. And I think, we've been waiting for the 2020s for quite some time. Alvin Toffler and various others have been talking about anticipatory democracy since the 1970s. Limits to growth has always projected, and many other climate scientists have talked about how the intersection of environmental, demographic, and therefore geopolitical shifts are all going to come at the same time and require a different way of making decisions that is much more future prepared, but also can connect into the kind of technological innovations that are then around. So I think that's what Futures and Foresight can therefore do, is help reframe the moment that we're in, not as a moment of the death of liberal democracy of 200 years or that kind of narration of like, how can we go around addressing the symptoms? How can we stop particular governments from driving authoritarian agendas, but instead seeing that as symptoms of a place where actually the solution is to put time and energy into reimagining what the future looks like in a constructive way. Now, this sounds all very theoretical. What it looks like in practice in the United States is, instead of wondering, like hand-wringing around Supreme Court / gerrymandering / etc., all of which are very important to worry about, also need to have time and space to look at positive conceptions of what a 21st century American Constitution could look like. So some really interesting work being done by Constitution 2076, by state level activists of all hues coming together to kind of reimagine the future, looking at well-being economies, looking at future generations' capabilities, both, this is in Montana, Vermont, California, etc. So that's a really interesting reframing of what's happening in a particular country. Then also reframing of what's happening in, for example, the nuclear counter-proliferation space or the nuclear space. It's just like, are you seeing what's, is this the end of an era, or is this the moment at which we can kind of rethink and get insights from different adjacent policy communities like climate financing, health emergencies, to rethink what actually the nuclear counter-proliferation infrastructure can look like that's fit for the next 50 years. So that's the kind of opportunities that become possible. Also, you have, and this is back to the question that you had around where are the infrastructure, where's the changes going to happen? It's by connecting those kind of actors with the early adopters in government that are really championing change and willing to do things differently in the ministries of finance, to measure GDP differently, in the parliaments where they're setting up committees of the future, for example. And those are the signals of hope that I see, and the opportunity on the back of the Summit of the Future to weave all these different strands together, those weak signals, those very tiny glimmers right at the beginning, but that can thicken and become, over the next 5 years, a force for really reframing what's happening around us as a force for good.
Well, thank you so much, Kat. I think, honestly, this is one of the most hopeful conversations that we've had on the show for quite some time. Hopefully we can get you back in the future to solve some more problems for us. But for now, I just want to say thank you very much. It's been really fascinating.
Thank you so much, Jane.
Well, that was a really wide-ranging conversation. I feel if you scanned my brain right now, you would see all these different areas lighting up at once. But I think really there are two broad and distinct themes that recur to me when it comes to factoring the future into our discussions about policy and politics, right? And one is about short-termism. The idea, for instance, that Kat mentioned of a government paying its debts today by raiding the primary school budget. Like, we all know that's a bad idea. That's obviously a bad idea. But sometimes governments will take those decisions that harm future generations because it's politically expedient today. The other, second issue is the more complicated issue of when you just don't know what is going to be beneficial in the future, because the future might look so different. So it's about contending with uncertainty and the unknown as a necessary fact of politics. And how do we give our politicians permission in a way to do that? It just makes me think sometimes of, back in 2010 in the UK, when the Conservative Party were introducing austerity, there became this bizarre and ridiculous debate about, does the finance minister have a plan B? And the idea was, if he had a plan B, that was bad, because that meant that he thought his policies weren't perfect. So he would say, no, I have no plan B. But actually, we need to give our politicians permission to have plan B and plan C and plan D, because stuff is going to change, shocks are going to happen, and we need to be able to be flexible and to adapt. So those are the things I'm really mulling over after that discussion. But anyway, if you want to have a brighter and more interesting future, follow the show if you don't already. For more on today's show, subscribe to our Substack for lots of juicy, exciting future stuff. And please check out the show notes. We've put quite a few interesting links in there for you to read and learn more stuff. I'd like to thank our producer, George McDonough, and our executive producer, Neil Fern. And have an orderly week.